So I think we're live. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Open Rooms number 19 now, Moral Turpitude. So my name is Sorcha Boyle and I'm the Responsive Programme Coordinator at Open Eye Gallery. And I'm delighted to be joined tonight by photographers Roxana and Pablo Allison and Savannah Dodd, the founder of the Photo Ethics Centre. So they'll be in conversation tonight about the project and publication Moral Turpitude. So just to give you a little bit of background on the project they'll be discussing, Moral Turpitude is not a coincidence, but a sequel derived from Roxana and Pablo's previous personal story, Operation Jurassic, which documents their first encounter with the British criminal justice system. Moral Turpitude portrays a second chapter of incarceration, this time in the USA at the hands of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. A shared experience of confusion where the missing link is two words enclosing an unclear meaning but a severe consequence. Through drawings, legal paperwork, personal documents, photographs and words, Moral Turpitude portrays a lived experience common to thousands of Latin American migrants. Remotely conceived, each one from their own side of the story and geography, Roxana and Pablo's personal testimony attempts to offer a window into the complex and multi-layered legal limbo that hundreds of migrants experience while highlighting the vital role that family and support networks play in someone else's release. So the publication of this project was released in August 2021, and I'm delighted to be joined tonight by our speakers. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our speakers before handing over to them. So brother and sister Pablo and Roxana Allison were born in Manchester and grew up in Mexico City. Their socially driven work focuses on themes of migration, displacement and justice. And they combine collaborative photography projects with their own individual practice and commissions. And Savannah Dodd is the founder and director of the Photography Ethics Centre. She's responsible for designing and delivering workshops, lectures, and other educational content. She has worked with international audiences from a wide range of sectors, including media, academia, and international development. Savannah's background is in anthropology. She earned her master's in anthropology and sociology at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva, and her bachelor's in anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. She's currently pursuing her PhD in anthropology at Queen's University Belfast, where she's examining the ethics of archiving photographs in post-conflict societies. Prior to founding the centre, she worked in international development sector for NGOs and IGOs in Switzerland, Uganda, and Thailand. Alongside her work with the centre, Savannah maintains her own photography practice. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So yeah, just kind of to let you know the format of the event, I'm going to hand over to Savannah, Roxana and Pablo for an in-conversation about the project for about 40 minutes or so. And there will be time, about 10 minutes at the end of the event, just for any audience questions. So if there's anything that comes to mind that you'd like to ask our speakers, please just pop it in the chat at the side of the Twitch stream. You can also tweet us if that suits you better. So yeah, I'm going to hand over now to Savannah to kind of kick off the conversation.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that very descriptive introduction, Sorcha. And thank you so much for having me to be here in conversation with these two brilliant artists. I wonder if Roxana and Pablo, if you could start maybe just by describing a little bit the background to this work to try to bring everybody up to speed with the work, because I've had the privilege of seeing it, but I'm sure a lot of people haven't.
Do you want to describe, Pablo, your side of the story?
Go for it.
Do you want to do it because, well, do you want to describe how Moral Turpitude starts because you're the main subject in that story, or?
Okay, so moral turpitude, the definition of moral turpitude is that it's basically you get convicted of crimes of moral turpitude when a judge deems you to be a threat to the lifestyle of people in that country, and that country meaning the United States in this case. I'm not sure where moral turpitude, in what other countries moral turpitude applies. But anyway, that's the crime that I was sentenced to. And the reason for that was that, or the story starts when I continue working on the Migrant Trail, which I've been documenting since 2017 specifically. And I took a journey from Central Mexico by freight to up to the border with the United States, and then entered the United States legally with my British passport, and then continued my journey. The first part of the journey took around 20 days, 2 weeks roughly. Then the second part of the journey took a little longer, because I decided to remain for a little longer in Northern California before I continued my trip up to the border with Canada, which is where I was going to do the final stretch of my journey, crossing from west to east of Canada. The journey all in all was going to take around 2 months or something like that. But then on the border between Canada and the United States, I got stopped and subsequently detained by US Customs, who then questioned me for hours and then determined to shackle me and put me in a cell, and eventually drove me in a Homeland Security van without me knowing what the hell was going on all the way. Took about 4 hours on the motorway to drive up to this compound surrounded by fences. And when I woke up, I realized that I was in a prison. And when I asked the officers what I was there for, or what was this place, what was it? And they said it was an ICE detention. It was clear to me that I was actually on my way out of the United States in a very different way to the way I entered the United States. That's in brief, the subject of the whole story. But obviously there's many more layers to it that we can discuss today.
And I mean, there's a connection with the first episode of imprisonment of Pablo in the UK. But at that moment in time, when Pablo is detained by ICE and sent to this detention center, it's not clear. We still don't know what the connection is. And we connect it further down the line, and almost at the end of Pablo's detention in this immigration detention center, which is basically a prison.
And at what point in this process, I'm sure a very disorienting process, did you realize that this was something that was that you wanted to creatively continue on from Operation Jurassic? And what's been your intention for this work through that process?
Do you want me to answer, Pablo?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the first encounter with the criminal justice system was in 2010, when Pablo is arrested and interrogated or questioned by the police, because the police were carrying out, the British Transport Police were carrying out a massive investigation to crack down on graffiti artists, and so it was a big investigation, but they then pinned it down to 5 graffiti artists, one of them being Pablo. And that investigation started in 2003 and ended in 2009. And then Pablo was arrested in 2010. And then there was 2 years until he was actually sentenced to 19 months imprisonment. So throughout that process of digesting what was going on, me and Pablo decided to take it on as if we were on a assignment, documenting the whole process that we were going through. And at the same time, it helped, in my case, detach myself from the actual situation, which was very unnerving and I was very unfamiliar with a criminal investigation process. And we kind of knew it was coming because Pablo's graffiti wasn't legal in many of the times he was doing it. So we thought that at one point it was going to happen, and the day came and it actually happened. So mentally, you kind of are prepared for it, but you're never prepared enough for an outcome, which is a prison sentence. So throughout that process, I kind of diligently took it on to document it, and that helped me as a means of therapy to navigate the whole situation. And then we established our collaboration, and it became very clear that because we had access to this personal situation, but which mirrors the situation of many other people, we had to just find a creative way of hanging on to something positive at the end of it. So as much as it was very creative and maybe gave us focus, it also presented an opportunity to make something positive out of a negative experience, but also get to know each other as brother and sister in a very different context that we hadn't really explored before. And although we were close, the actual process of taking the pictures, discussing it, and the mental states we went through made us feel closer to one another. And my role in that was to support, but at the same time, I was living through that process from a family member's perspective. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, and I've gone on a tangent, but our perceptions and the way we dealt with the situation is very different. So I dealt with it as a therapy through pictures, taking pictures, and Pablo's is a different take. So yeah.
Pablo, would you like to add anything to that? Or...
Yeah, in terms of your specific question about when it was that we decided to take this second episode on board, it was immediate. I mean, it was straight after or during the first phone call to my sister that we just knew that this was going to end up being a second part of, well, not a second part. Well, I don't know if we actually said it's going to be a second part. We did say, though, that it had to be documented. And I think that it was really important for it to be documented because in a way, for me, like it did with the first sentence and the first stretch in prison, it gave me focus and it gave me a platform and a path to follow that made my days mean something, and yeah, basically took me out of boredom and nothing to do. I thought it was really good and positive to make the most out of that experience. So it was an immediate response that, we thought this has to be this, and we, I applied the same process that I'd applied previously, which was to document my surroundings as I would photograph my surroundings or surroundings in general. I use a very sort of straight on way of photographing, and the drawings were sort of sorted out in a way that I was observing the scenery inside the prison cell or the outsides in the same structure. And I actually consider these drawings as photographs rather than pictures. But yeah, that's basically the way we figured it out. And I believe for both of us, that was the immediate sort of.
Yeah, the only difference with the Moral Turpitude project is that it's not as photographic as Operation Jurassic because of the circumstances, basically. So we weren't in the same geography. I didn't really feel how it was easy for me to respond photographically to what Pablo was living through miles away from the UK. So because we'd done Operation Jurassic before and we included documentation in that process, then this one turned more into a documentation, and it was a very raw one with all the actual paperwork, the legal work, the drawings that Pablo did, and were kind of referencing the Operation Jurassic process that we'd kind of already gone through. So yeah, so we included this time elements in the technology that we used to communicate, which was quite different to how we communicated with in Operation Jurassic. Actually, WhatsApp wasn't a big thing back then when Pablo was in prison the first time, but this time was my means of communicating with a friend we have in common and who would update me on what was happening or what I needed to do, or we just figured out ways of dealing with situations that otherwise would have been very, very costly and very difficult as well. So there was that as well in the mix. So that became one of the main elements in the actual project itself.
Yeah, I think that there's something really relatable about that as well, looking through the project and having those WhatsApps included is it's an experience that's very foreign to many of us, but the experience of using WhatsApp and being so reliant on that as a means of communication, I think really felt very, very relatable as I was going through it. I've got so many questions to go from there. I mean, I think that there's so much in this to unpack, but one sort of small question before we move on is just something I'm a bit curious about, is whether you faced any challenges, talking specifically to Pablo, about recording your experience while you were detained. Were you prevented in any way from creating documentation, or were they okay with it? Or what were the actual logistics like of doing that?
You mean you mean for the second project, for what we're discussing today? In terms of, I mean, I think I'm very lucky to have been able to extract lots of documents that I used for my own reasons. So I would run out of paper and I would grab the legal forms and I would use them to create portraits of the people around me for many reasons, artistic reasons. And my bed, or my bunk bed, was never raided by the prison guards, which is something that they usually do to see if you're handling illegal substances and stuff like that. So and when I was released finally, they didn't go through my stuff, and that was a great thing, because it allowed me to bring with me the history of being in there. And it states it very clearly that you cannot use these documents for any other reasons other than for what they're intended for. So there was an element of luck there, and when it came to drawing the environment around me, I never really got a question. In fact, the COs would look at that's the guards, the prison guards. They would look at my drawings and they would be quite curious about what I was drawing. And when I was drawing portraits of the prisoners, they would be interested, So, because sometimes I would create a small crowd around me, because it was a cell that housed 80 plus people. So it was a big compound. So other than that, I didn't encounter any other restrictions or any other sort of problems. And I think a lot of it was luck.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was just something that was in my mind as I was going through it. So thanks very much for sharing that. Something that you both have mentioned as well that I think is really important, at least to me, it seems like a really important aspect of it, is you've talked a lot about the personal benefits of doing this project. And it's really interesting because I think you can think about creative practice as a form of self-care, right? I think Roxana, you said that it gave you an ability to detach yourself from the situation, to maybe look at it maybe more objectively, something to work toward. And Pablo, you mentioned that it gave you focus when you didn't have much to do during the day. But I can imagine that equally doing such a personal project can also take a toll. And I guess I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, about did you find that it was that part of your experience? Did it take a bit of a personal toll? And if it did, how did you check in with each other, especially as collaborators? And how did you take care of yourselves throughout that process?
Yeah, it was, for me, it was quite a hard thing to go through a second time around. And I think from the moment Pablo was detained and I received a message from our friend in common, I was dreading like the situation, especially being so far away and not understanding at all how the US criminal justice system works, and in terms of immigration, even less than anything else. I would not understand how to navigate that. And it'd been a couple of years that we had finished Operation Jurassic as a creative process, which took us 8 years in the making. So it was quite a long process of making that project and going through it and revisiting it and giving it breaks. And then Moral Turpitude lands in, which I was not expecting. I knew it could happen, but I didn't really think about it too much as a possibility. I thought the possibility of Pablo going back to prison would be graffiti itself, not so much an immigration situation. So I felt, first of all, worried, but also the dread, and also very angry, because inevitably somebody that goes to prison, it has an effect on the family. And as much as you love that person and you want to support and help, it does drain you and it interferes with your daily life. So I had to kind of just act in response as required, and then not give it too much thought as in how I was feeling. Because at the end of the day, and I've mentioned this before, it's love that you put at the forefront to be able to navigate through another process, another painful process like this one, where the uncertainty is even more present, because you just don't know the system and communication isn't easy. So I had to draw a line after Pablo comes out of the detention center, and just kind of separate myself from the project itself, because I could not continue with the making of a project after it had been an experience that I hadn't really had the chance to discuss with Pablo because of many different issues, because life, because we were both doing our own projects, and we don't live in the same geography, so communication is a bit of an issue sometimes. So making Moral Turpitude was, I felt myself separate from the project to be able to actually make it happen, but putting more of I left a lot of it to Pablo to put together after I had my part in it. And I kind of came to that decision. It wasn't an easy one to make, because we both consider ourselves authors of the project and at the same level, but we had to admit that maybe it was healthy to just separate myself from it and delegate a lot of the responsibilities of making it happen to Pablo. Whereas in Operation Jurassic, it was kind of the other way round. So I had a lot of the making of the Operation Jurassic project, not so much in terms of taking the pictures and that, but the actual publication itself. And I had maybe a lot more energy in that one to make it reach the conclusion we wanted. But with Moral Turpitude, maybe it was also to do with the fact that Pablo was the one that lived through that very closely, whereas I wasn't, and I felt like his voice was stronger in it than mine, although we both are parts, important parts in that project. But I still felt like it wasn't exactly the main, I wasn't the main focus on it. We weren't at the same level. So that was also an opportunity for maybe for Pablo collaboratively, but him taking the lead in that was suitable for this project, for moral turpitude. Yeah.
Pablo, do you want to add anything to that, or are you happy to move on?
Did it take a toll? I mean, it did, because it obviously, like Roxana said, it's being inside a prison and being you're restricted from your freedoms is not something that you as a prisoner are the only one that bears that burden in life. So, you know, it's important to acknowledge that many other people around you, such as your family and friends, have an effect on that. It has an effect on them, on the situation. So it was difficult, but at the same time, for me, it was about focusing in order for me to not, you know, go through a worse off situation with my mental health. And that was the case with the first and the second sentence. So I think a lot of it is on the way you deal with a prison sentence, either whether it's a long one or a short one, is through focusing and not having the feelings that can break you interfere. Because if those feelings interfere in your life while you're going through a really difficult situation, then it just becomes much more difficult to deal with it. I think it's perhaps the aftermath of that, when you get released from prison, that's when you realize the whole impact it has on your mental health and so on and so forth. So yes, I mean, it involves, it encircles a hell of a lot of different emotions and feelings and situations that it's difficult for me to narrate right now what I was going through at the time. I mean, this happened in 2019 and the previous one happened in 2012. So I would have to dig very deeply into myself to understand what actually I was going through. But there was definitely a lot of feelings within both projects, or within the situations that became projects in the end.
I think, I mean, one of the reflections of how draining the situation was, because also in moral turpitude, the uncertainty was more present than it was with Operation Jurassic. Like the outcome of how long Pablo would stay in prison, we just didn't know, because they kept saying to me, they kept saying that he was being deported the following Tuesday, and that Tuesday arrived. And I thought, okay, well, he must be back in Mexico. And it wasn't true. He was still in prison. And it just, the 3.5 weeks felt like, I don't know, 3.5 months. Whereas with Operation Jurassic, we knew that when he reached the sentence, the hearing, sorry, then we knew that that sentence of 19 months was gonna happen, and he was gonna come out either before that time or at the 19-month end of it. But with the other one, it wasn't that way. So also, when I remember when Pablo came out of the one in Tacoma, he just couldn't talk about it. He was drained, like he didn't really have the energy to explain anything or to say anything. And I was very much of like, how are you? How did it go? How are you feeling? Talk to me. And we were completely on different radars. We could not, I could not push him, and he felt pushed, and he could not really express how he was feeling, maybe because it is tiring as well. I mean, so all of that was in the mix of, are we going to make a project about this? And then when we look at it now, it was just a few months before the pandemic. So in that, Pablo was released in August. He came over in September to do a talk with Red Eye and Edmund Clark. And a few months later, we were in lockdown in February, March. So it had been a few months of lots of things happening, and then another type of uncertainty, but the collective one of COVID. So everything was just very turbulent in my point of view. And the first talk I did about this project, I just couldn't dimension what I was going to talk about, because we'd just gone through the pandemic, and to just revisit what happened pre-pandemic felt like it was ages ago, but it wasn't. And then when I thought, of course, I felt completely baffled because all of that happened in a very short period of time. And then the book came out. So, and Pablo and I hadn't really had profound conversations about this until very recently, where we had the time and we had that space to actually maybe just empty our feelings about this project in particular.
Yeah, you know, I feel like you've both talked a lot about how emotive, you know, the intense emotional response, both of being a family member and living with that uncertainty, and but also being the person in that situation, and the personal toll, and how, you know, you almost have to bury it to keep progressing or keep moving forward. And it reminds me, just, you know, in your description of how burdensome and stressful the experience was, that's something that you said previously. I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, but you mentioned it in a previous conversation to me as well. You said something about how you chose to exploit your own experience rather than people who are usually exploited, who are usually in the position having those really intense experiences, and then maybe a documentarian comes in and wants to you know, illustrate that, but you actually chose that to do with yourselves, knowing that you were going through this difficult time. And I wonder if you could just maybe talk about that a little bit and expand on that.
I think that I wanted to interject straight away, because I did want to talk about that. You know, when we look at documentaries on prison and things to do with restricted environments, usually it's the person documenting the other. And in this case, it was, you know, us documenting ourselves. Now, it's one aspect which is important to mention, which we omitted, was that I had been, when I was young and I was studying a BTEC at Hackney Community College in 2004, it was, I got invited by Hackney Council to document a prison. And I was young and I was attracted to that because obviously, you know, it surrounded the list of interests I had in urban life and such and such. And the intention of the council was that me and two other photographers, women photographers, and myself, three of us, would go there and photograph the way the prison looked, but trying to depict the horrendous lifestyle that people lived in the prison for a day. So we went to Wormwood Scrubs. I didn't know what Wormwood Scrubs was, and then I was told it was a prison and that it was a really old prison, and that, you know, all these different things about this horrible prison. And I went, to make the long story short, we went there, we got escorted around the prison, and it was a day's work. And for me, it was really difficult to actually capture the horrible side of that prison, because we were not shown the ugly aspects of that prison, except the filter wing and the surroundings. So, and I didn't know what I was, and what I'm trying to say with this is that I was the person looking at them. And I lived that experience as a photographer, as a young photographer, you know, looking at them and feeling sorry for them. And I would see the prisoners in their cells, and it would cause an impact on me. But at the same time, I was looking for what I have, which is my other side of myself. I was looking for the Mexican references in that prison, and I didn't find them. So I thought, this is like a holiday, you know, this doesn't look like the threat that I would encounter in a place like Mexico. But then, you know, so that material was used, and I was, you know, as I said, I'm going around in circles now, but I was there as the viewer of those people. Now, to juxtapose that with what happened in Moral Turpitude, I've been documenting migration for the past 5 years. And I've been on the road, I've been on the train, and this is more of my personal experience, which kind of like detaches my sister and I from what we did. But it's important to mention that I've had the luck and the fortune to be around people that are in a much more less privileged position than I am. And I've never seen them as the others, because that's something that in my philosophy, I've tried to sort of shape my understanding of humanity through the work I've done. But it was clear to me that when I went into the prison, I'd heard all these stories of people migrating and getting arrested by Homeland Security, and then being detained and then being sent to ICE all the time. And when I got detained and sent to this prison, I was there as another prisoner. I never felt that I had any more privileges than the other people. In fact, but people did inside the prison, they had sort of suspicion of me because of how I looked, how I sounded, the fact that I spoke English to them perfectly. In the end, they realized that I was just another one that was in the prison. But my experience there was, you know, it was again kind of similar to the first one in Operation Jurassic, where I was looking at and then photographing, and on this one, I was looking at from outside, but then I was inside and I was capturing the environment indoors. I'm not sure if that responds to your question, but I had to say that.
I think it's because we going back to the main sort of, well, to the question itself, from my perspective, we were in the belly of the beast, and we just thought, well, let's just document this, because this is not a unique story. This is happening to many people, and it doesn't really, you don't see these stories a lot. You see the story of the graffiti writer who is this bravado male, testosterone all around, but you don't really get to see the behind the scenes of all of that, which is sometimes a prison sentence. And we thought, this is a prison sentence, but lots of people that are going to prison for other reasons will have similar feelings, especially the family, especially the friends. So, and also Pablo, within that prison, he was experiencing it as an inmate at the time, but those outside of that, we were trying to sort things out for him as well. So all the legal aspects, the housing aspects, the benefits aspects, all of that, getting him a new pair of trainers, etc. All of that as a family member. Lots of other family members are dealing with the same situation. Me going to visit, my idea of a prison was, like Pablo's described, a prison in Mexico, which is a terrible situation. Like, you don't want to be even a visitor in a prison in Mexico, because the experience is traumatic every time you visit. So I was having these similar references, like, how is it going to be for me to go to visit Pablo? Am I going to be searched all through? Am I going to have to take my clothes off, like in Mexico sometimes? So it wasn't, and it was a relief. But we then, because we had all this wealth of information and pictures and all of that, we felt we had a voice that other people could reflect themselves in. And maybe that answers part of what Pablo has said from his perspective, but also in a broader sense, that was another reason to make the project happen. We're not representatives of anyone, but our own story could be a reference to other people's stories.
Absolutely. And I guess I was wondering as well, I mean, you sort of already touched on this as well, Pablo, that your philosophy and your mindset when you're documenting people is already really trying to work against othering them through your photographs or through how you're thinking about them. But I am wondering as well if the experience of creating Moral Turpitude and also Operation Jurassic has made you think differently or act differently or do anything differently when you're photographing others.
Yes, and not I'd say not just with the operation, not with these two projects, but also with the work I've been doing in Central America, Mexico, and to some extent in the United States. I am very much against this idea of the others, and not just as a photographer, but as a human being. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very short answer. I think it has to be very straightforward answer, and it is trying to view people as human beings and not just as subjects. You know, I really can't stand it when I was recently photographing the flow of migrants or people from Central America in October, and I was there with two photographers. I don't actually consider myself a photojournalist, and I make that distinction very clear. I mean, I've got nothing against it, but I just don't operate within the protocols that a photojournalist works in. And it was very clear to me with these Mexican photographers that they were very strict about their protocols. And they were using this, the subjects, they were talking all this language, which distances you from people that are, they're in need, you know? And it got to the point where something not very good happened, and we had to take a decision I had to take a decision to sleep somewhere when it was late at night in the middle of nowhere. And I decided that I wanted to sleep with all the other people that were sleeping on the road. And the photographer was, no, this is very dangerous around here. You should leave. We should go to a hotel, blah, blah, blah. And we were having an argument, and he was saying, can you lower your voice? Because we don't want them to hear us, because the migrants are going to hear us, and we're going to make a scene of this. And I was just like, God, you know, I'm so glad I can make that distinction in my head and see his lack of humanity, carrying a camera and feeling embarrassed that the migrants are going to listen to us and that we shouldn't make a scene out of this. And I just, it just makes me feel very uncomfortable to see. I've been in situations where I just hide the camera and I just pretend. Obviously I can't pretend because I do look like I stand out like a sore thumb, but there's tens of photographers interfering in the process of and the struggle of people, and they don't seem to care, and it just really annoys me. And in fact, recently in October, I shouted out at a reporter from a big mainstream news channel in Mexico, not just news, but a mainstream channel in Mexico called Televisa. And I said to him, what you're doing is you're just documenting this to name and shame the migrants, and your opinion is stirred among the population by what you say. And he was trying to intimidate me, because I confronted him and he intimidated me, and I said to him, and he then looked at me and with evil eyes, and I said, what are you going to do? And he was kind of like ready to fight me, but he couldn't, of course, because he represents a huge network in Mexico. And obviously I wasn't going to fight him, but it would have been really interesting if he had like put the camera down and tried to fight me, because it would have caused a whole scene. I'm telling you. But those are the kinds of attitudes that I'm completely against. And it's it's cemented even more. It has been with the work that I've done with my sister, the two last projects, Operation Jurassic and Moral Turpitude. But that has been, I've been able to understand that and apply that to my personal work, and try not to operate like the privileged photographer, even though I know I am in many respects. I'm a privileged human being. And it's very important to be aware of that. I have my own privileges, but if I have my own privileges, therefore I need to try to help other people with less privileges. And I'll name one last example of what happened before I pass on to my sister, since you asked me. And I was in a very, very difficult situation in 2018. I was separated alongside 600 other people from the caravan, and we got stuck in an area which is quite a dangerous and difficult area for migration and for people, citizens. And we were then confronted with several police, with municipal police with high weapons, you know, what do you call it? AK-47s or something like that, and immigration officers. So what I did is I made a phone call to a photographer that I had met in the caravan. And I said to her, look, this is what's happening right now. They want to make us get off the train and they want to arrest everyone. And I want to see if, like, you know, you can call out any networks right now. It was like 4 o'clock in the morning. So can you call out to any networks in Britain or anywhere just to make an announcement about what's happening? Because it was a very difficult situation. In fact, all the people on the train, on the top of the freight, were ready to throw rocks at the armed forces. And I was trying to shout out to everyone to not do it. So I want to believe that I actually stopped what could have been a lot of blood. And what she said to me was quite shocking, but she said to me, don't interfere, don't do anything, just make the best pictures you can and don't do anything, just stay away from everything. If I hadn't interfered, if I had used the camera as the main thing around me, or I can't find the word, but the priority, if I'd used my photography skills as a priority and not got involved, a different situation would have entailed. I'm pretty sure about that. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, you know, what kind of an answer is that? You know, it's just disgusting, and it happens quite a lot. That's me.
That's a really interesting example, because I think it really gets at the heart of, you know, photojournalism, and I guess, you're saying a distinction between photojournalism and other forms of photography or activist photography or you know, other forms of visual arts. And I think it's a really interesting conversation to have about, you know, at what point is intervention important? At what point is it, do we have a moral imperative to put down the camera and intervene? And I don't know, it's a very interesting example. Sorry, Roxana, would you like to add to that?
I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to mention another example of this othering, and it's the prison system itself. Like, the prison system, to communicate with somebody inside, is a private entity which is called Getting Out. And when I accessed my account I had to open to talk to Pablo, I kept getting other people's profiles, as in detainees that I could have a conversation with. And it had their whole names on there, their picture, their date of birth, the time they were sent to prison. All of that information I thought was absolutely unethical to have in public view, because who knows who I am looking at all this information. And it just worried me, because I thought, well, who is accessing my own information as a relative of somebody in that prison, and who is accessing Pablo's information across the whole network of prisons and Getting Out and who else? So that's another example of immigrants or migrants are, in my point of view, once you label somebody as a migrant or an immigrant, it has a complete different discourse behind it. But in that case of that prison, which is an immigration prison, it feels as though they can do whatever they want with them. so they can actually just let all the information there out free for anyone to access, and there's no problem. So again, othering and disregarding people's right to privacy and all that, for me was just, I just thought this is unacceptable, but we have to go along with it because it's the system. So yeah.
No, it's a really interesting example, absolutely, and I think really relevant to the field of photography in general. Sora, are there any questions from Twitch that we should be paying attention to?
We just have one, so let's see here. But yeah, we have about only a few minutes left. So yeah, thanks very much for that. Really kind of interesting conversation. And yeah, we have one question from Liz that came in, and it was, whilst you're making work which is clear about a very personal situation, you're raising a much broader conversation around huge issues on migration and human rights. And do you ever feel a kind of weight on your shoulders covering those topics? Or is it the fact that you explore them from the personal context of your kind of cathartic process that you hope others might relate to? Yeah, wonder what your thoughts were.
In my case, it's the second one. So I do think of like the responsibility of putting our story out there. But at the end of the day, it's a cathartic process for me. And that's the way I think about it. It does cross my mind though, like, what responsibility do I have, or am I speaking for someone else which hasn't asked me to? But then if I think about the so many questions and variants, I would probably never produce work. So it would stop me probably. So instead of maybe self-censoring and all that, our stories are out there. Sometimes it weighs on us, or on me at least, how much we are telling about ourselves, about our personal life, and how is it going to impact decisions we make in the present and future. But at the end of the day, as people that are sensitive and creative, that's the way we choose to express ourselves and deal with certain situations in our lives. So that's the price I am prepared to pay. The other thing is, in terms of Pablo's identity, it's a different question, because he's putting his face out there, and he's done things that have been, I wouldn't say a crime. They're not, in my point of view, graffiti shouldn't be considered a crime, but or at least it shouldn't be considered a crime that sends you to prison. But that was more of an issue. But we had long conversations about how much Pablo was happy with sharing, and if his full disclosure of his identity was going to be in the book. And at the end of the day, we just thought, or Pablo just thought, well, let's just do it, because that's the way the story unfolds. So let's just see what happens. And that's what we did.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I was just kind of interested in a couple of things, but one around whether like making work about these kind of like situations that have happened where like so much is out of your control. Is there an element of trying to kind of like regain agency over the situation?
Definitely.
On like a personal level?
Definitely, to some degree, there's a sense of control within a situation which is completely out of your control. So yeah, that was one of the main motivators, I think, but we may have been unconscious of it at the time. We just did it because we had to do it. We dealt with it that way. But yeah, looking back, it was definitely a way to gain some control. Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we have any more questions from the audience. Do you have anything else that you would want to touch on that you haven't already? Or?
Well, the book is this one. So there's a few copies left, and they can be purchased through my website or in the physical form at Open Eye Gallery and the ICA and Village Books in Leeds. So I mean, fortunately, it sold really well, and a lot of people will have a very personal insight into a story that is common to many migrants, many people crossing the US-Canada border, or any border in the world to some degree. So the book is the size of a passport, a little bit bigger, and it's full of lots of information as if it was like a diary, like a traveler's diary, but much darker, because it has emails and pictures. And it was designed by Mark Starbuck, who is a very good designer that we know, and we've worked with him several times now, especially Pablo. So yeah, it's self-published, not so self-published, but yeah, self-financed. And that's why the cost of the book isn't that low, because there's a lot of work put into it as well. And it's tailored in such a way that it feels like an evidence bag, which it is, but it's quite unique the way it's been put together. So so definitely something to delve into and spend time with. And Operation Jurassic is similar, but it's sold out, so we don't have any more copies. But it has a similar format, and because they're part of a very similar story and they're connected, then it was only natural to us to adopt the same format for this second one. So I think there's loads more that we could say. There's so many avenues that these stories can take, but it would take us probably another hour to completely dissect it all. But it's been a pleasure to talk about it, and thank you very much for inviting us to do this, and Savannah for leading the conversation.
Yeah, I second that too. Thank you very much to Open Eye Gallery, to Savannah, for giving us a platform to talk about this project. We did try to, because I'm not based in the UK, although I have been coming quite often, and there was a few events lined up, but then for some reason or another, we couldn't manage them. So this is a good way to wrap up with this year with presenting a book that's, yeah, there's hardly any copies of it, but there's still a few available. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the story the story is quite a sensitive story, both of them, Moral Turpitude and Operation Jurassic. They're not the impactful story of the prison, the tough prison that these stories are normally portrayed as. And I think when we say it's a story about, in this case, my brother's imprisonment and our process of going through that, they expect to see sometimes these images of bravery and aggressiveness and violence within a prison. But when we show them what it is, they really don't know how to react, maybe. So it hasn't had as much exposure as we thought the project could have, and maybe one of the reasons is that it's not a full-on story about prison. It's about all the feelings and the relationships and the emotions that a brother and sister have throughout that process, which is something that you don't see very often. It's opening up your raw state to the world, and that can feel quite uncomfortable from both sides, to see that and to also get seen.
I think that's a really beautiful description, and I think it also speaks to the importance of this work as well in showing a different side, a different perspective, and a much maybe softer, a more emotive representation of that experience. So thank you both so much for your work, and thank you for inviting me along to talk about it with you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Our pleasure. Thank you to Open Eye Gallery as well.
Yeah, I just want to say my thanks too. So yeah, thanks to all of you for the conversation, and for everyone who came along tonight to the event. I feel like, yeah, there's so much more that we could like touch on. So yeah, I would love to kind of stay in touch on your future projects as well. Yeah, I think we were going to drop the link to the book just in the chat as well. So keep an eye out on the side of the stream if you would like to pick up a copy. But yeah, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.